Hi, this is Heather Jerome from heatherjerome.ca and from the sonatasandpartitas.com. This video is yet another video about articulation in early music. Is specifically discussing the Allegro from BWV 1003 in A minor. I'd like to discuss the articulation insofar as how Bach has a slur set up, and also insofar as how Frank Kuntz and I, in our edition, have set up the fingerings to sort of bring out the slurs as much as we could. Now, I'd like to start by looking at the second bar. Now, in the second bar, there's a repeated figure that covers 2 beats. And the first beat inside that figure has a slur. Now, what I'd like to point out is that the notes inside that slur move by step, and the other notes in the figure that don't move by step aren't slurred. Now, this is because the violin mimics singing, and singing tends to move by step. And the reason that singing tends to move by step is that singing mimics speech in an exaggerated sort of way, and speech tends to move by step unless people are feeling really upset or really emotional in some way or another. So now that that's clarified, let's go back to the beginning. Now, at the beginning, we have an arpeggio, and that's followed by a stepwise beat, and then that little figure is repeated. Now, the thing I want to point out here is if you're going to compare the type of articulation that you naturally get on the guitar or the keyboard and the type of articulation that you would naturally get on the violin, comparing arpeggio passages and stepwise passages, it's reversed. Like on the guitar, if you have an arpeggio, you can have a million or different arpeggio patterns. They'll sound connected. You can get this wonderful wash of sound. Same with the keyboard. But on the violin, those arpeggio patterns and the arpeggio sections tend to be detached. And that bowing was actually called détaché bowing. It was expected to sound detached. The stepwise passages, which mimic singing, which mimic speech, those ones are the ones that are connected. Now, I was really struck by this when I first started exploring the sonatas and partitas, how true that held, that most of the arpeggio passages were in détaché bowing, and in a large part, the stepwise passages were slurred. I mean, of course, it's not 100% of the time, and Bach is endlessly creative within that. Another thing that would be for another video is that the slurs are also very dependent on rhythmical hierarchy. So that's a big topic, fascinating topic that we will discuss in another video. Now, of course, I'm not saying that as guitarists we should be playing all these arpeggios detached. But what I am saying is that there's a lot about articulation that we can learn from the violinists, things that they just take as a given. So Bach starts off his Allegro with a nice clearly defined arpeggio, followed by a stepwise passage, and then that repeats quietly. So right away in the first measure, there's a lot of excitement and contrast. And then in the second measure, there's that 3-note slur and the arpeggio, and again, that's repeated quietly. So more contrast. Now, a guitarist playing from our edition with our 2-note slur might be tempted, and would maybe likely be tempted, to articulate it as strong, strong, weak, strong, like. But Bach's 3-note slur implies something a lot more smooth than that. Now, if a guitarist wants, a guitarist could also articulate it in that way. Now, in the third measure, the articulation is really interesting because of the absence of slurs. Now here, Bach is really challenging the violinist. I mean, the bow's going to be going pretty fast, and you're going to need a nice loose bowing arm to pull that off. In our guitar edition, we actually considered putting some slurs there. It would have made the passage easier, and it would have been very natural on the guitar to have little 2-note slurs at those 32nd notes. But in a way, it would have been like a lost opportunity, because a lot of the charm of this piece comes from the contrast of when there are slurs and when there aren't. And the piece is very much built around that articulation and that contrast in articulation. Now, a fingering that works really well for that passage and for several other passages like it in that Allegro is to just keep repeating AMI. Now, I will also say that when I was working out my fingerings for the Allegro, my right hand fingerings, I used my A finger absolutely as much as I could, and I also used it in combination with M as much as I could. So then when those AMI passages would come up, the hand is just ready to fire it in at that speed fairly easily. Now looking at the rest of that first page, it's all in steady 16th notes. Now when you see something written in steady 16ths, it doesn't mean necessarily play it in steady 16ths. I mean, you can, but there are options. You could play it in dotted eighths, triplet eighths, dotted 32nds, or dotted 16ths, or any combination of like the infinite subtleties in between all those. Now in my recording, I played bars 5 and 6 somewhat freely. Mostly I wanted to bring out that top melody note. In bars 7 and 8, I used more of a dotted rhythm. In bars 9 and 10, I played it somewhat straighter, but I still wanted to keep that sense of exuberance and joy. Now, one thing that I love is the way that Bach uses those 3 and 4 note slurs, and then the way that he sets them against those little passages that are not slurred. And so I'd like to look at the second page in that regard. Now, something to consider for guitarists playing from our edition would be the comparison between what might be implied in Bach slurs compared to what might be implied in our guitar slurs. Now, if you look at measure 14 in the first beat, Bach has a 4-note slur there. So the last note under that slur would be expected to be a little quieter and a little shorter than the other notes. But on the guitar edition, we have the 32nd note slurred. And what guitarists would often tend to do is play the note after those 32nd notes as a stronger note, so that we have a 2-note slur and they would go da-da-dun. But Bach's slur implies more for the 4 notes, da-da-lun-dun-da-da-da-da-lun-da-da-lun-dun-da, instead of dun-da-da-dun-dun-dun. And it does have more of a flow with Bach slurs. And guitarists can play it like that also if they choose to. Now what I did in my recording was that when those figures were ascending, I used our 2-note slurs. I thought they worked really well. When the passage was descending, I just decided to use 3-note slurs, partly because I think they sound different on the guitar, especially classical guitarists don't tend to use 3-note slurs that much. And also Allegro means joyful. I thought that they just gave this piece a sense of fun, like unbridled joy and abandon. Now this passage leads directly into measure 17, where again we have these little 32nd note figures that are not slurred. So again, I thought the AMI fingering worked really well for me for that. Now moving ahead to measure 19. Okay, one of the great things about working with a colleague is that you can shamelessly brag about them. And honestly, I think the world of Frank, and I was always amazed at how well he understood the left hand on the guitar and how well he understood how you could use it ergonomically and with musical intentions. And so here in measure 19, this fingering was Frank's idea. And there is actually also a similar fingering that you can do in measure 49, but we'll come to that later. Anyway, if you look at measure 19, now Bach has those 4-note slurs, and then there's a single unslurred note, and the passage, the articulation repeats. So now what would happen again under those 4-note slurs is the last note would be quieter and shorter, and then you have this little singular note on an up bow. And then again, 4 notes on a down bow and a single one on an up bow. And Frank's fingering just works really great for that, to be able to detach the last note under Bach's slur and make it a little bit shorter, and then just jump ahead and grab that single note on an up bow. And really it just feels like the hand is dancing up and down the neck. It's super fun to do, and it just completely works with the musical intent of that little passage. And that leads right into this really smooth chordal passage that closes the section. Now, because right-hand fingerings can be so highly personalized, we didn't include them in our edition. But since I mentioned earlier in the video how I use that AMI combination pretty much as often as I could in this movement, I wanted to mention that I used it in this chordal section at the end kind of in unexpected places where you wouldn't normally use AMI. But for me, it was very comfortable on the hand. It sort of fit with the general way I was using my right hand in this movement. And it also helped me get the musical intention that I wanted with having those chords very connected with a nice clear bass line. Now, if you have our book and you wanted to try out that fingering that I had mentioned in measure 49, it's actually interesting because the passage starts halfway through the bar instead of at the beginning of the bar. And that's something that I've noticed that Bach does quite commonly in the second half when he has something repeated. It'll be metrically shifted over so that the strongest beat will be the weaker strong beat in the bar. Anyway, this is what happens at measure 49, and here is the new fingering if you wanted to try it. And this page also has improvements in the bass line. For example, in measure 49 and 50, we were able to use a little formula. It's one of those little formulas that we describe in the critical notes of our book. They were often used as partimenti. Anyway, that formula worked well in that passage. And then from there to the end, we just sort of reorganized the bass line so that it sounded more directed. So anyway, if you want to get the PDF, let us know. And you can compare the two bass lines. You can either pause the video and copy it out in your score, or if you want me to send you a copy of it, just send me a message at sonatasandpartitas.com and I will send you an updated PDF. So I hope you found this video helpful. As always, let us know what you think at sonatasandpartitas.com. And if you want to find out when new videos are uploaded, you can subscribe to our channel and turn on your notifications.